A woman may survive being forgotten, but she cannot survive being written into an inventory like a chair. On the morning Duke Adrian Blackwood arrived at Evershade Abbey, Clara Whitmore stood beneath the great staircase with a silver tray in her hands and her name buried at the bottom of a legal document. Outside, the Atlantic wind struck the cliffside windows hard enough to make the old glass tremble in its lead frames, and a grey rain swept in from the Maine coast, turning the long driveway into a ribbon of black mud. The abbey rose above it all like a thing that had endured too much to collapse, its stone towers dark with salt, its chapel bells silent, its narrow windows watching the world with the patience of a condemned saint. Clara had polished the entrance hall before dawn. She had scrubbed the marble until the faded crest of the Whitmore family looked almost alive beneath the candlelight. Iris and thorn. Grace and ruin. She knew every line of that crest because it had been carved above her cradle, stitched into her childhood blankets, pressed into the wax seals of letters her father never dared send in public. Yet that morning she wore a plain grey servant's dress with cuffs mended twice, her pale hair pinned beneath a linen cap, her face lowered as if humility could make her invisible. It never had. It had only made her easier to use. The carriage wheels stopped outside at precisely 9 o'clock, and every servant in the hall stiffened as though the abbey itself had drawn breath. Mr. Silas Hartwell, the late Duke's attorney, smoothed his black coat and smiled the small dry smile of a man who trusted paper more than mercy. "Remember your place," he murmured without looking at Clara. She did. That was the cruelty of it. She remembered every place this house had given her. The window seat in the West Library where she had learned to read Latin. The greenhouse bench where her father had taught her the names of orange blossoms. The blue nursery that had been locked after her mother died. And now, the foot of the staircase, where she was expected to stand with tea while strangers divided the bones of her home. The front doors opened, bringing in cold air and the scent of wet wool. Duke Adrian Blackwood stepped across the threshold without ceremony. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in mourning dark clothes that made his fair skin appear even colder beneath the shadow of his hat. His hair was black, dampened by rain, his eyes a clear, severe gray that moved over the hall with military restraint. He did not look impressed by Evershade Abbey. He looked as if he had come to judge it, and had already found it guilty. Behind him, 2 clerks carried leather cases filled with deeds, ledgers, and seals. Hartwell bowed deeply. "Your Grace, welcome to your new estate." Adrian removed his gloves finger by finger. "I have not decided whether it is an estate or a mausoleum." No one laughed. Clara kept her gaze lowered, but she felt him notice her. Not as a man notices a woman. As a master notices a servant standing too still. Hartwell gestured toward the long oak table where the transfer documents had been arranged. "Everything is prepared. Land, furnishings, livestock, coastal rights, remaining staff, and domestic obligations." Adrian's expression did not change as he began to read. His gloved hand passed over acreage, debts, art, silver, stable equipment, linens, books, even the cracked bell in the old chapel. Then it stopped. Just once. Clara saw it. A pause no larger than a heartbeat. His eyes returned to the final page. "There is a person listed beneath the silverware." Hartwell gave a soft, practiced sigh. "An old formality, Your Grace. The girl has no family, no independent wages, and no papers beyond household attachment. She has been maintained at the Abbey for years. Naturally, she transfers with the property." The words fell neatly. Cleanly. Like folded linen over a grave. Adrian looked up then, directly at Clara. His gaze was not kind, but it was not careless either. "Your name?" The tray grew heavier in her hands. "Clara, Your Grace." Hartwell's eyes sharpened. "Clara is sufficient." Adrian ignored him. "Clara what?" For the first time that morning, silence moved through the hall with weight. The housekeeper stopped breathing. One of the footmen looked at the floor. Rain tapped against the windows like nervous fingers. Clara could feel Hartwell's warning beside her without needing to see his face. She thought of the locked West Library. The missing diary. the half-burned birth record hidden beneath her floorboard. She thought of her father's voice, low and ashamed, calling her my child only when the doors were closed. Her throat tightened, but her chin lifted by the smallest measure. "Clara Whitmore," she said. Hartwell's smile vanished. Adrian's eyes narrowed, not in anger yet, but in attention. "Whitmore," he repeated. The name belonged to the dead Duke whose debts had ruined this house. It belonged to portraits under sheets and monograms on silver, and the crest beneath Adrian's boots. It did not belong, according to any document on that table, to the girl holding tea at the foot of the stairs. Hartwell gave a light laugh. "A sentimental habit. The late household allowed her the name out of charity." Clara said nothing. She had learned that truths spoken too early could be made to sound like madness. Adrian took one slow step toward her. "Do you belong to this house, Miss Whitmore?" The question struck deeper than insult. Clara's fingers tightened around the tray until the china trembled. She looked past him, toward the staircase her father had once carried her down when she was 5 years old and frightened of thunder. Then she met the new Duke's gaze. "No, Your Grace," she said quietly. "This house once belonged to me." The silence that followed Clara's answer did not break at once, it spread. It slipped under the doors, climbed the walls, and settled among the veiled portraits, like dust disturbed after years of waiting. Duke Adrian Blackwood stood 3 steps from her, his face still, his gray eyes fixed upon hers with an intensity that made every servant in the entrance hall seem suddenly distant. He did not demand that she explain herself. He did not laugh. That, somehow, frightened Clara more than mockery would have. Mr. Silas Hartwell recovered first. "A childish attachment to grand phrases," he said, his voice smooth enough to pass for patience. "The girl was raised here, Your Grace. Servants in old houses often imagine themselves part of the stone." Adrian did not look away from Clara. "And do stones answer questions with family names?" Hartwell's mouth tightened. "With respect, Your Grace, you will find Evershade burdened with many strange customs. The late Duke was sentimental in his decline." Clara lowered her eyes again, not in surrender, but because she had already spent all the courage she could afford before breakfast. The tray in her hands had begun to tremble, and the delicate cups chimed softly against their saucers. The sound reached Adrian before her fear did. His gaze moved to her fingers, white around the silver handles, then to the thin scar where old cold had marked the knuckle of her right hand from winters spent carrying coal to rooms she had once entered as a child. "Put that down," he said. Clara obeyed because refusal would have looked like pride and obedience like training. The tray touched the side table with only the smallest sound. Hartwell smiled again. "Very good. Now, if Your Grace would be so kind, we have signatures requiring attention." Adrian turned back to the oak table, but the room had altered. He read the documents with the same restraint as before, yet Clara could feel the difference. The new Duke was no longer merely receiving an estate. He was listening to it. He asked questions Hartwell had not expected. Why had the West Library been sealed? Why were 3 greenhouses listed as unusable when one still had a working furnace? Why did the household accounts include wages for servants no longer employed? Why was Clara's name written without a surname in one ledger, and with a private maintenance charge in another? Each question landed quietly. Each one made Hartwell's answers thinner. Old confusion. A clerk's habit. The late Duke's generosity. No legal importance. Clara stood by the staircase with her hands folded, feeling the Abbey awaken around her in small, impossible ways. The old mastiff, August, who slept near the hearth and obeyed no one, lifted his gray head when she shifted her weight. The clock in the gallery struck 10, although it had been silent for 3 days. A draught moved through the hall and stirred the black veil over the portrait of her father, revealing for one breath the stern outline of his jaw. Adrian saw that too. She knew he did because his eyes moved upward then back to her. By noon, rain had thickened into a hard coastal storm. The clerks were sent to the former steward's office, Hartwell withdrew to arrange additional papers, and Adrian began his first inspection of Evershade Abbey with Clara ordered to guide him, though Hartwell phrased it as service rather than permission. "The girl knows the practical corners," he said. "Kitchens, linen rooms, cellar passages. Nothing of consequence." Clara picked up a candle and led the Duke through the north corridor, where salt air had stained the wallpaper and family portraits hung beneath grey cloth. Their footsteps echoed over stone that had once known music. Adrian walked beside her, not behind, which unsettled her more than command would have. "How long have you lived here?" he asked. "All my life, Your Grace." "As a servant?" Her fingers tightened around the candlestick. "That depends on which record is speaking." A pause. "And which record should I believe?" Clara stopped before a narrow window overlooking the cliff path and the dark Atlantic beyond it. Waves struck the rocks 200 feet below, breaking white against the black shore. "None that Mr. Hartwell brings you first." It was too much. She knew it as soon as the words left her. Yet Adrian only studied her profile, the pale line of her cheek, the quiet defiance held so carefully beneath practiced stillness. "You choose your warnings carefully, Miss Whitmore. Careless warnings are expensive." "Who taught you that?" She looked toward the sea. "This house." They continued through the music room, where a grand piano slept beneath a dust cover, then past the morning parlor with its cracked marble fireplace. At every door, Clara knew which hinge stuck, which latch needed lifting, which window looked sealed but opened if pressed at the lower corner. Adrian noticed. He noticed the way the housekeeper, Martha Bell, straightened when Clara entered the servants' passage. He noticed how the kitchen maid almost curtsied before remembering herself. He noticed the west hall, where Clara slowed despite herself before a locked pair of carved oak doors. The handles were shaped like irises. "What is this room?" he asked. "The West Library. Hartwell said it was unsafe." "Mr. Hartwell says many things that keep doors closed." For the first time, something like a shadow of feeling crossed Adrian's stern face. Not warmth. Not yet. But attention sharpened into concern. He reached for the handle. Clara stepped forward before she could stop herself. "Please do not." Adrian's hand stilled above the brass. "Why?" Her breath caught. Behind those doors lay the last room where her father had spoken to her as if she were not a secret. Behind those doors, if Hartwell had not already found it, was the diary that could give her back her name. "Because some rooms do not forgive strangers," she whispered. Adrian withdrew his hand slowly. The gesture should have meant nothing. It felt like mercy. As evening settled over Evershade Abbey, the storm wrapped the house in rain and fog until the world beyond the windows disappeared. Clara returned to the entrance hall to trim the candles, believing the Duke had gone to his study. Instead, she found him standing before the veiled portrait of the late. By midnight, Evershade Abbey had become a house of listening doors. Rain traveled down the windows in crooked silver lines, and the Atlantic wind pressed against the walls as if the sea itself wished to enter and reclaim whatever the dead had left unfinished. Clara Whitmore moved through the servant corridor with a covered lamp in one hand and the other hand wrapped around the silver pendant at her throat. Iris and thorn. Grace and ruin. She had worn it beneath linen and wool for so many years that the metal had warmed to her skin like a second pulse, but now it felt heavy, almost accusing. Duke Adrian Blackwood had seen too much in a single day. He had noticed the portrait. The West Library. The way the old servants looked at her when they thought no one was watching. Worst of all, he had noticed that Evershade did not treat her like a girl who belonged below stairs. The house remembered. That was dangerous. Clara climbed the narrow back staircase to the little room above the old chapel, where the ceiling slanted low and the rain found its way through a crack near the chimney. The room had once stored hymnals and candle boxes. Now it held a narrow bed, a washstand, 2 dresses, and the last pieces of a life others insisted had never existed. She knelt beside the loose floorboard beneath the bed and lifted it carefully, pausing when the wood gave its familiar soft groan. No footsteps followed. No shadow moved beneath the door. Still, her heart beat as if discovery stood inches away. From the hidden hollow, she drew out a small cedar box no larger than a Bible. The brass latch was tarnished green from damp, and the lid smelled faintly of smoke. Inside lay three things: a miniature portrait torn across one corner, a folded letter whose seal had been broken years before, and a birth record singed along the edges until the ink had curled into brown ghosts. Clara set them on the quilt one by one. Her mother's face looked up from the portrait, pale and gentle beneath a ribbon of blonde hair, her smile carrying the kind of sadness that had no language in public rooms. Evelyn Marsh had not been a duchess, not a lady of title, not a woman society would have allowed to stand beside a Whitmore at the altar. She had been companion to the late Duchess, educated, quiet, and poor enough that love could be called an error by anyone richer than she was. Clara touched the torn edge of the portrait. Her father had kept it in the West Library, locked in the second drawer of his writing desk, behind estate maps and old tax ledgers. He had shown it to Clara only once. She had been 7 years old and still small enough to sit on the carpet by his chair without understanding why he always closed the door before saying her name with tenderness. "You have her eyes," he had whispered. Then someone had knocked, and he had become the Duke of Whitmore again. Not father. Never father where witnesses could hear. Clara unfolded the damaged birth record. Most of it had survived. Her name. Her mother's name. The date. A physician's signature. But the line where her father's acknowledgement had been written was burned through, leaving only the first letter of his title and the final stroke of his name. Mr. Hartwell had done that the week after the funeral. She had found the paper in the hearth before dawn, still warm beneath the ash, and had carried it away in her apron as if saving a wounded bird. Since then, she had lived on fragments. A torn portrait. A ruined certificate. A letter with words too tender to prove anything in court. The real proof was in the diary behind the locked doors of the West Library, if Hartwell had not taken it. If it still existed. If her father had not lost courage even on paper. A soft knock came at her door. Clara froze. The lamp flame shivered. "It is Martha," a voice whispered. Clara opened the door just wide enough to admit the housekeeper, a small woman with silver hair and eyes that had spent too many years watching injustice from the edges of rooms. Martha Bell carried a folded towel as an excuse, though no one would be awake to question her. "He is asking questions," Martha said. Clara closed the door. "The Duke?" Martha nodded. "About you. About the West Library. About why Hartwell holds the keys to rooms he never owned." Clara pressed her hand to the cedar box. "Then Hartwell will move quickly. He already has. I saw him send a telegram to Portland after supper." The words struck with quiet force. Portland was 50 miles away, where Hartwell's firm kept offices, clerks, and locked cabinets full of revised truths. Clara looked toward the rain-streaked window, beyond which the cliffs vanished into darkness. "He will destroy whatever is left." Martha's mouth trembled, but her voice stayed steady. "Not if His Grace reaches it first." Clara almost laughed, though no humor rose in her. "You think a man who purchased this house yesterday will risk his name for a servant today? I think he looked at you as if the ledgers had offended him. Ledgers offend no one for long. This one did." For a moment Clara let herself remember Adrian's hand stopping above the West Library handle, the way he had withdrawn when she asked him not to enter. A command would have been easier to understand. Mercy had no place in her expectations. She closed the cedar box and slid it back beneath the floorboard. "I cannot trust him." Martha stepped closer. "No. But perhaps you can let him distrust Hartwell." That, Clara knew, was different. Far safer. Far more dangerous. Downstairs, in the study that had once belonged to her father, Adrian Blackwood stood alone before a spread of estate papers, the candlelight sharpening the severe planes of his face. He had dismissed his clerk's hours before, yet still he read. One ledger placed Clara among unpaid household dependencies. Another recorded private expenses for her education until age 16. French tutor. Music instruction. Medical care. Books. No servant received such entries. No charity lasted that long without a reason. Adrian turned a page and found, pressed between two accounts, a dried white iris. Beneath it, in the late Duke's hand, was a line crossed out so heavily the paper had nearly torn. My daughter must be protected from the men who would profit from my shame. Adrian stared at the words until the rain seemed to fall inside the room. Then he reached for the bell and rang once. When the footman appeared, sleepy and startled, the Duke spoke without raising his voice. Find Mr. Hartwell. Tell him I require the key to the West Library before morning. Mr. Silas Hartwell did not surrender the key before morning. He arrived in the study at 7 o'clock with his coat perfectly brushed, his expression arranged into wounded dignity, and both hands empty. Dawn had come pale and reluctant over the Maine coast, turning the rain-washed windows silver while the Atlantic battered the cliffs below Evershade Abbey. Duke Adrian Blackwood stood behind the late Duke's desk, the dried white iris and the crossed outline hidden beneath a sheet of blotting paper. He had not slept. There was a stillness in him now that made even the fire seem careful. The key, Adrian said. Hartwell bowed. Your Grace, I regret that the West Library cannot be opened at present. The structure is unsound. I would be negligent to allow you inside. You would be negligent to mistake a locked door for law. Hartwell's smile thinned. The legal affairs of this estate are delicate. Certain documents remain under my professional protection until the transfer is fully settled. This estate is mine. The building, yes. But not every memory inside it. Adrian looked at him for a long moment. How convenient for men who edit memory. The color in Hartwell's face changed by only a shade, but Clara, standing at the breakfast-room door with a coffee service she had not been asked to bring, saw it. So did Adrian. Nothing more was said about the key, not then. Hartwell withdrew with another bow, and by noon Evershade Abbey had been transformed for the formal dinner he insisted could not be postponed. Families from Ravensport and the surrounding estates arrived in polished carriages, their wheels hissing through wet gravel, their voices bright with curiosity and concealed hunger. They came to see the new Duke. They came to measure the ruin of the old house. Some, Clara knew, came to enjoy the fall of a family they had once envied. The dining room had not held so many people in years. Candles burned in tall silver branches along the table, throwing light across crystal glasses, dark paneling, and the long row of Whitmore portraits that Hartwell had ordered unveiled. For historical dignity. Clara understood the cruelty at once. Her father's painted face watched from above the mantel while she stood below in a servant's dress, carrying soup to men and women who had once accepted his wine, admired his horses, and bowed beneath his roof. Martha had begged to assign another maid. Hartwell refused. The girl knows the room, he said, with that dry softness that never needed to raise itself to wound. Clara entered with the first course, her steps precise, her breathing measured. The guests noticed her gradually. A glance. A whisper. A pause too long over a wineglass. Mrs. Lillian Prescott, widow of a shipowner from Bar Harbor, tilted her head as Clara served near her chair. What an extraordinary resemblance, she murmured. For a moment I thought I saw someone I used to know. Hartwell, seated near the head of the table by Adrian's reluctant permission, gave a mild laugh. Old houses breed illusions, Mrs. Prescott. Servants absorb gestures the way curtains absorb smoke. A few guests smiled. Clara felt the words settle on her shoulders like dust. Adrian, at the head of the table, did not touch his wine. His eyes moved from Hartwell to Clara, then to the portrait of the late Duke above the mantel. The resemblance was no illusion. In candlelight, it became undeniable. The same pale brow. The same grave mouth. The same quiet refusal to beg for what should never have been taken. Lord Pembroke, a red-faced gentleman whose family had once borrowed money from the Whitmores and repaid it with gossip, let his napkin fall deliberately near Clara's feet. There you are, girl, he said with a genial cruelty disguised as habit. Do make yourself useful. Clara looked at the white linen resting on the polished floor. Every eye seemed to lower with it. She could have refused. She could have spoken. She could have let the room burn with the truth held behind her teeth. Instead, she bent because the servants behind her would suffer for any pride Hartwell could not punish directly in her. Her fingers had almost reached the napkin when Adrian's voice cut through the candlelit air. "Leave it!" Clara froze. So did the room. Adrian set down his knife, the small sound carrying farther than a shout. "Lord Pembroke is quite capable of retrieving what he has dropped." A silence followed, deep and appalled. Lord Pembroke blinked, then laughed once, uncertainly. "Surely, Your Grace, it is only a napkin. Then it should not trouble you." Color rose up Pembroke's neck. Slowly, with visible discomfort, he leaned down and picked it up himself. No one smiled now. Clara straightened, still holding the serving dish, her face calm because calm was the last wall left to her. Adrian looked at the guests along both sides of the table. "No living person is inherited at my table." The words did not tremble. They entered the room like law. Hartwell's hand tightened around his fork. Mrs. Prescott lowered her eyes. Martha, standing near the sideboard, pressed a hand briefly to her mouth. Clara could not look at Adrian. If she did, something carefully sealed inside her might open, and this was not a room where tears would be safe. Dinner continued, but the Abbey had changed temperature. Conversation moved stiffly from shipping routes to winter roads, from Boston politics to the price of lumber, yet beneath every polite sentence lay the thing Adrian had done. He had not named Clara. He had not rescued her with tenderness. He had done something more dangerous in public. He had refused the lie. After the final course, as the guests gathered in the drawing room, Clara slipped into the shadowed corridor carrying a tray of unused glasses. Her hands shook only after she was alone. She set the tray on a narrow table and pressed both palms against the cold wall. Behind her, a door opened. She turned quickly. Adrian stood there, the candlelight behind him turning his dark coat almost black. For a moment neither spoke. Rain whispered down the windows at the end of the hall. "You should not have done that," Clara said at last. Lord Pembroke embarrassed himself. "That is not what I meant." "I know." His voice softened by the smallest degree. "I also know you were going to bend because someone else would pay if you did not." Clara's breath caught. It was unbearable, being understood so accurately by a man who still held the deed to her prison. Adrian reached into his coat and withdrew a small brass key, old and tarnished, its bow shaped like an iris. Clara stared at it as if it were a flame. "Hartwell lied," he said. "There was a duplicate in the chapel registry box." The corridor seemed to tilt beneath her. The West Library. Her father's room. The last possible truth. Adrian held the key out, but did not place it in her hand. "I will open the door tonight," he said. "But I need you to tell me what he is afraid I will find." Clara looked at the key, then at the man holding it. Outside, the sea struck the rocks 200 feet below, and inside the Abbey, every buried thing seemed to rise toward the sound. "My name," she whispered. "If it still exists." The key to the West Library was colder than Clara expected. Adrian placed it in her palm only after the last guest carriage had rolled away from Evershade Abbey, and the house had fallen into the strained quiet that follows public humiliation. The storm had weakened to a fine mist, but the Atlantic still moved restlessly below the cliffs, its dark water breaking against stone with the patience of something eternal. Clara stood beside the locked doors with Adrian at her shoulder, the brass iris pressed into her skin, and for one terrible moment she could not turn it. So many years had gathered at that threshold. Childhood lessons. Her father's voice. Hartwell's warnings. The sound of the door closing after the funeral and never opening again. Adrian did not urge her. He simply held the lamp higher, allowing its amber light to fall across the carved oak, the tarnished handles, and the dust gathered in the grooves of the Whitmore crest. That patience undid her more than command would have. Clara slid the key into the lock. It resisted, then yielded with a low metallic sigh that seemed to pass through the walls. The doors opened inward. The West Library smelled of paper, cold ashes, and lavender long since dried to memory. Moonlight lay across the floorboards in pale rectangles, revealing shelves that climbed 2 stories high, a marble fireplace blackened with age, and a great desk turned toward the sea-facing windows. White sheets covered chairs and globes like shrouded witnesses. Nothing had been touched. Or almost nothing. Clara stepped inside as if entering a chapel. Her hand found the edge of the desk by instinct. "He used to sit here when the fog came in," she whispered. "He said the sea made honest men uncomfortable because it never pretended to be still." Adrian's gaze moved over the room, absorbing the details a clerk would miss. The small chair placed near the desk, too close for a visitor, too familiar for a servant. The stack of old children's books in French. The faded ribbon tied around a bundle of pressed irises. "You were taught here," he said. It was not a question. Clara nodded. "Until I was 16. After that, Mr. Hartwell said education made girls discontent." Adrian's expression hardened, but he said nothing. He crossed to the desk and examined the drawers. The upper ones opened easily. Estate maps. Correspondence. Receipts. The lower right drawer was locked. Clara's breath changed. "That one." Adrian looked at her. "Are you certain?" "No. But I have been afraid of it for 6 years." He searched the desk, then the mantel, then the inkstand. No key. Clara knelt beside the fireplace, remembering her father's habit of hiding small things where only a child would think to look. Beneath the carved wooden trim, her fingers found a loose panel. She pressed. A narrow compartment opened, and a little iron key slid into her hand. For a moment, she was 7 years old again, delighted by secret doors and unaware that grown men build them because truth is not always safe in daylight. The drawer opened with a dry whisper. Inside lay a leather-bound ledger, a packet of letters tied with black ribbon, and an envelope addressed in her father's hand, for Clara, when silence has cost too much. She could not touch it. Adrian saw the color leave her face. "You do not have to read it tonight." "Yes," she said softly. "I do." But before she could break the seal, a sound came from the corridor. A board creaked. Adrian turned at once. The library door stood half open, the hall beyond it empty, yet both of them knew what they had heard. Someone had followed. Adrian took the envelope, not to possess it, but to protect it, and moved to close the door. In that instant, Clara noticed a second paper tucked beneath the ledger, half hidden under the blotter. She drew it out and saw columns of numbers, signatures, transfer dates, and Hartwell's initials repeated beside altered sums. Her eyes moved faster. Maintenance charges. Legal fees. Debt consolidations. A trust account redirected. A guardianship payment cancelled. Then, at the bottom, a line written in careful ink, Whitmore Benevolent Trust, primary beneficiary, Clara Evelyn Whitmore. The room seemed to lose air. Adrian returned to her side, and together they stared at the proof. It was not only her name Hartwell had buried. It was money meant to shelter widows, educate tenant children, repair fishermen's homes after winter storms, and provide Clara with lawful independence. Hartwell had not merely hidden a daughter. He had stolen the mercy her father left behind. Adrian's voice, when it came, was low enough to be dangerous without being loud. "This is why he wanted the room sealed." Clara's eyes burned, but no tears fell. "He told me the trust failed because the estate was ruined." "It did not fail." Adrian lifted the ledger and checked the dates. "It was redirected through legal invoices to his Portland office." He paused, turning another page. "And some of these signatures are not your father's." Clara looked toward the portrait above the fireplace, where the late Duke Whitmore had been painted in middle age, stern and sorrowful, one hand resting on a book. "He tried," she whispered. It was the first kind thing she had allowed herself to say about him in years. Adrian heard the grief beneath it, the complicated wound of a child loved in shadow and denied in sunlight. "He did," Adrian said. "Not enough. But he tried." Those words, fairer than comfort, reached her where comfort could not. The door suddenly opened wider, pushed by no wind. Martha stood in the threshold, pale and breathless, one hand pressed to her chest. "Mr. Hartwell has sent a man to the telegraph office," she said, "and there is a carriage being readied at the east gate." Clara understood before Martha finished. Hartwell was not waiting for morning. He would remove the office records, claim legal confusion, perhaps vanish behind sealed documents, and respectable friends. Adrian gathered the ledger, the letters, and the trust papers with controlled precision. "No one leaves the estate without my permission." Then he looked at Clara, not as a servant, not as a burden transferred in ink, but as the one person whose truth could undo every lie in the house. "Miss Whitmore, I need to know whether there are more records outside this room." Clara closed her fingers around the sealed envelope bearing her name. The fear was still there. It had lived too long to leave quickly. But beneath it something older stirred, something born before shame, before silence, before ledgers had tried to make her small. "Yes," she said. "In the chapel beneath the floor." The chapel beneath Evershade Abbey had not heard a prayer in years, yet when Clara led Adrian and Martha down the narrow stair behind the vestry, the air felt crowded with things once begged for and never granted. Their lamp flames leaned in the draught, casting long, wavering shadows over the stone walls, where salt had bloomed white in the cracks and old hymn numbers still hung crooked on a board near the door. Above them, the house stirred with distant urgency. A footman crossed the corridor. A door shut too quickly. Somewhere toward the east gate, horses stamped against wet gravel. Hartwell was moving. So was the truth. Clara held her father's sealed envelope against her chest as if warmth alone could keep it real. The chapel floor was colder than the rest of the abbey, built directly into the cliff stone, with a small arched window facing the sea 200 feet below. Moonlight entered thin and blue, touching the abandoned pews, the covered altar, and the carved irises that ran along the base of the wall. Adrian paused at the threshold, not from hesitation, but from respect. He seemed to understand that this was no ordinary search through old masonry. For Clara, it was a descent into the part of her life everyone had told her to forget. Martha moved to the altar and lifted the cloth with trembling hands. "Your father had this chapel closed after Miss Evelyn died," she whispered. "He said the sound of hymns made grief too public." Clara remembered standing in this room at 6 years old, holding a white ribbon, not understanding why her mother's name was spoken softly and never from the pulpit. Her father had watched from the shadows, face pale, hands locked behind his back. He had not touched her that day. She had forgiven him for that 100 times. Then taken the forgiveness back. Adrian turned to her. "Where beneath the floor?" Clara looked down the center aisle. "Under the 7th iris." The words had come from a childhood memory, half game, half warning. Her father had once tapped the carved stones with his cane and said, "If ever the house turns against you, little Iris, count what remains faithful." She knelt near the altar rail and counted the carved flowers along the floor border. 1, 2, 3. Her breath grew shallow. 4, 5, 6, 7. The 7th iris had a small flaw in one petal, shaped like a tear. Adrian set the lamp beside her and crouched at a careful distance. "May I?" She nodded. He pressed along the stone edge, then found a groove nearly hidden by dust. With slow effort he lifted the tile free. No violence. No haste. Only the old stubborn weight of a secret being asked to move. Beneath it rested a narrow iron box wrapped in oilcloth, untouched by damp. Martha covered her mouth. Clara could not move. Adrian lifted the box and placed it before her on the chapel floor. "It should be your hand," he said. No one had said such a thing to her in years. "Your hand. Your choice. Your name." Clara untied the oilcloth. The box opened with the little iron key from the library drawer. Inside lay a diary bound in dark blue leather, a certificate protected between wax sheets, a stack of letters, and a smaller velvet pouch embroidered with the Whitmore crest. Clara reached first for the certificate. The paper was intact. Her vision blurred before she read the first line, but she forced herself to continue. Clara Evelyn Whitmore. Born at Evershade Abbey. Daughter of Evelyn Marsh and Thomas Whitmore, Duke of Whitmore. Acknowledged by private declaration and sealed before witnesses. There it was. Not charity. Not rumor. Not sentimental habit. Blood, ink, witness, seal. Adrian exhaled slowly, as if he had been holding his breath on her behalf. Martha began to cry silently. Clara did not. The proof sat in her hands too solemnly for tears. It was not joy at first. It was weight returning to the body after years of being made into smoke. She opened the diary next. Her father's handwriting filled the pages, elegant at the beginning, increasingly uneven near the end. Adrian turned away slightly, giving her privacy, but Clara spoke because silence had cost too much already. I loved her mother beyond courage, she read, her voice thin but steady. And when courage failed me, Clara paid the price. Let no man say she was kept from honor by lack of worth. The lack was mine. The chapel seemed to hold the words. Even the sea below sounded farther away. Clara turned another page. The Whitmore Trust is hers in purpose if not in title, until the law can be made to obey decency. Hartwell presses me to simplify the estate. I no longer trust his eyes upon my papers. Adrian's jaw tightened. He knew he was being watched. Too late. Clara whispered. Perhaps not. Adrian took the ledger from beneath his arm and placed it beside the diary. Your father left more than confession. He left a pattern. Hartwell's altered accounts against the original trust entries. That is not a misunderstanding. That is a case. Clara looked at him then, truly looked, past the ducal title, past the cold manners, past the man who had entered her home believing it his to command. Candlelight softened nothing about him, yet it revealed something she had missed before. He was angry not because his purchase had been compromised, but because a wrong had been dressed in law and handed to him as ownership. Why are you helping me? She asked. The question was quiet enough to be mistaken for breath. Adrian did not answer quickly. Above them, another door closed. Time pressed near. Because yesterday I allowed your name to be read as property, he said. And because no decent man remains neutral after learning he has been used to continue a crime. She wanted to trust that. She feared it more than disbelief. Martha touched Clara's sleeve. There is one more thing, child. Inside the velvet pouch lay a ring, not ornate, not a duchess's jewel, but a narrow band of gold engraved inside with 3 words, for my daughter. Clara's composure broke without sound. She closed her fingers around it, and bowed her head, not collapsing, not weeping openly, only bending beneath the mercy of being named by the dead when the living had refused her. Adrian stepped back, guarding the doorway while she gathered herself. He saw her not as fragile, but as someone who had carried a house on her shoulders while others called her small. Footsteps sounded above. Sharp. Measured. Hartwell's voice drifted faintly through the chapel stairwell, smooth even now. Your Grace? Miss Clara? I believe there has been an unfortunate misunderstanding. Adrian lifted the lamp. The light caught his gray eyes and turned them nearly silver. Clara rose with the certificate in one hand and the diary in the other. The ring rested in her palm like a warm coal. No, she said, and her voice no longer belonged to the servant corridor. There has been a very fortunate discovery. Hartwell stood at the top of the chapel stairs with a candle in one hand and a calm expression arranged carefully over alarm. Behind him, the narrow passage rose into darkness, and somewhere beyond it the abbey waited, its old stones holding their breath. Clara did not step back. The certificate rested against her chest, the diary lay beneath Adrian's protective hand, and her father's ring pressed a half-moon into her palm. For 6 years, Hartwell had only needed to enter a room for her to remember her assigned place. This time, she remembered something else. The 7th iris. The hidden box. The line written in her father's hand. For my daughter. Hartwell's gaze moved over the papers, then returned to her face with practiced pity. My dear girl, he said softly, You have no idea how dangerous old documents can be when read without context. Adrian placed himself one step forward, not between Clara and the truth, but between Hartwell and any attempt to bury it again. Then you will have ample opportunity to provide context before a judge. Hartwell gave a faint laugh. A judge? Over family sentiment and decayed ink? Your Grace, I fear the atmosphere of this house has affected your judgment. My judgment improved when I stopped accepting yours. The words struck cleanly. Hartwell's eyes cooled. You are new to Evershade. You do not understand how carefully matters had to be managed after the late Duke's decline. He was not himself near the end. He imagined obligations. He wrote contradictions. He trusted people who flattered his guilt. Clara felt the old shame approach like fog, familiar and suffocating. Not himself. Imagined. Guilt. The same language Hartwell had used for years to make love sound like weakness and truth sound like illness. She opened the diary, fingers trembling only once, and read from the page marked by the ribbon. Let any future court know that my mind remains clear, though my courage has often failed. I acknowledge Clara Evelyn Whitmore as my daughter, and I charge the Whitmore Trust with her protection. Her voice echoed against the chapel stones. Not loud. Clear. Hartwell's candle flickered. A private emotional statement. Adrian lifted the trust ledger. With matching accounts, witness declarations, and redirected funds. Administrative corrections. Forgery. Silence fell. It was Martha who moved next, small and silver-haired, stepping from the side of the altar with a folded paper held in both hands. There were witnesses, she said. Hartwell turned toward her slowly. Mrs. Bell, I advise you to remember your position. Martha's mouth trembled, but her eyes did not. I have remembered it too long. She handed the paper to Clara. Your father asked me to sign this. So did Dr. Hensley and Reverend Cole. Mr. Hartwell told us the declaration had been filed in Portland. I believed him because decent people are often foolish in the presence of polished men. Clara looked at the signatures. Martha Bell. Samuel Hensley. Reverend Amos Cole. 3 names, 3 living or traceable witnesses, 3 anchors against the tide of denial. For the first time, Hartwell's face lost its arrangement. Only for a heartbeat. Enough. Adrian saw it. You sent a man to the telegraph office tonight, Adrian said. I assume to warn your Portland office. Hartwell's composure returned in a thinner form. I conduct business at all hours. Not anymore. Adrian turned toward the stairwell and raised his voice, calm but carrying. Mr. Weller? The footman appeared behind Hartwell, lantern in hand, visibly nervous but resolute. Yes, Your Grace. No carriage leaves the east gate. Send a rider to Ravensport for Judge Elwood and Sheriff Carver. Wake my clerks. Every ledger from Mr. Hartwell's traveling case is to be placed in the drawing room under seal. Hartwell stiffened. You exceed yourself? Adrian looked at him with cold precision. No. I begin to correct myself. Clara heard the distinction and felt it settle in her bones. He was not pretending he had arrived innocent. He knew his name had been used, his seal, his purchase, his ignorance. He did not wrap himself in pride to escape that knowledge. He stood inside it and chose repair. Hartwell took one step down, his voice dropping into private warning. Miss Clara, consider carefully. Public claims invite public questions. Your mother's name will be spoken. Your birth will be examined. Society is not gentle with women born outside its preferred arrangements. The chapel chilled around her. There it was. Not denial now, but shame used as a locked door. Clara looked at the ring in her palm. For my daughter. Her mother's face rose in memory, not as scandal, not as whisper, but as a woman who had loved, suffered, and left behind a child with her eyes. Clara closed her fingers around the ring. Then let them speak my mother's name correctly. Hartwell's mouth tightened. You do not understand what you risk. I understand exactly what silence costs. The answer came from somewhere deeper than anger. It came from the girl who had carried tea beneath her father's portrait. From the child who had learned French beside a closed door. From the woman whose name had been written under silverware and survived the ink. Adrian turned slightly toward her, and for one breath the harsh lines of his face softened. Not with pity. With respect. Above them, the abbey began to wake in earnest. Footsteps crossed corridors. Voices murmured. Lamps were lit one by one until a faint golden glow reached the chapel stair. Hartwell looked upward, calculating. The night he had controlled for years was slipping from his hands, not through drama, but through witnesses, paper, and one woman refusing to lower her eyes. Clara moved past him first. Adrian did not guide her. He followed beside her. That mattered. When they reached the main hall, servants had gathered along the walls in coats thrown over nightclothes, their faces pale with fear and hope. Martha stood behind Clara. Adrian stood at her right. Hartwell entered last, carrying his candle like a man determined to look dignified while the floor disappeared beneath him. Clara walked to the great table where the estate inventory still lay from the morning before. The final page remained there, her name written as property. She placed her father. By the time Judge Elwood reached Evershade Abbey, the morning had turned the cliffs the color of wet slate, and a pale, uncertain sun had risen behind the last ribbons of storm. Sheriff Carver came with him, a broad, quiet man in a dark coat, followed by Adrian's clerks carrying sealed packets, copied ledgers, and the original documents recovered from the chapel floor. No one had slept. The servants stood straighter than exhaustion should have allowed. Martha Bell kept one hand on the back of Clara's chair as if the girl might still be taken from the room by a word. Hartwell sat opposite them at the long oak table, his face composed again, though the candle beside him had burned down to a blue-edged pool of wax. He looked less like a defeated man than a patient one, and that frightened Clara more. Patient men had time to turn truth into procedure. Judge Elwood removed his spectacles, cleaned them slowly, and examined the certificate under the gray light of the windows. "This appears properly witnessed," he said. Hartwell leaned forward. "Appears, Your Honor. That is the necessary word. The late Duke was emotionally unstable during his final years. Many indulgent statements were made regarding the girl." Clara felt every eye shift toward her, not with cruelty now, but with the heavy curiosity of people watching a life be weighed. She sat very still. Her father's ring rested on the table before her, small and bright beside the inkstand. Adrian stood behind his chair but had not sat down. He seemed carved from the same dark wood as the room, watchful and controlled. Judge Elwood turned a page of the diary. "The late Duke anticipated that objection. There are entries here affirming clarity of mind, along with references to Dr. Hensley." "Dr. Hensley is retired," Hartwell said quickly. "And in Vermont, last I heard." Martha lifted her chin. "He winters with his sister in Camden. 20 miles, not Vermont." For the first time, a murmur moved through the servants and clerks. Hartwell's eyes flicked toward her with displeasure, but Martha did not lower hers. Sheriff Carver made a note. Judge Elwood continued, "And Reverend Cole?" "Buried 3 years," Hartwell answered. Conveniently unable to confirm anything. Clara's hand tightened in her lap. Then the judge looked over the certificate again. "His church records are not buried with him." The sentence fell softly, but Hartwell's expression changed. "Not much." "Enough." Adrian spoke then. "I sent a rider to the Ravenport parish at dawn. The register is being brought here." Hartwell turned toward him. "You had no authority to interfere with church records." "I asked for a record. I did not alter one." Hartwell's silence was brief and sharp. Clara looked down at the ring, and in that tiny circle of gold she saw all the doors that had ever closed before her. The nursery. The library. The chapel. Her own name, sealed behind men who called themselves careful. Judge Elwood set the diary beside the trust ledger. "There is also the matter of funds. The original trust appears to name Clara Evelyn Whitmore as protected beneficiary. Hartwell spread his hands with sorrowful restraint. A benevolent intention, never formalized into executable inheritance. The estate was drowning in debt. I restructured accounts to preserve what could be preserved. Adrian placed a second ledger on the table. Then explain why payments marked as legal restructuring were deposited into an account held by your Portland firm. The room went quiet. Hartwell did not look at the ledger. Complex debt instruments often pass through professional offices. For 6 years? Adrian asked. Under 3 different labels? With the beneficiary's name removed after the Duke's death? Judge Elwood adjusted his spectacles. Sheriff Carver stopped writing. Clara felt the whole room lean toward the question. Hartwell's voice cooled. Your Grace, I caution you against making accusations born from moral enthusiasm rather than financial literacy. Adrian's answer came without heat. My father was ruined by men who hid theft inside difficult language. I learned to read the language. Clara turned toward him, surprised by the quiet confession. For one instant she saw not the new master of Evershade, but a boy somewhere else, in another house, watching dignity sold piece by piece under seals and signatures. Wounded people recognized ledgers differently. They knew how cruelty sounded when it wore polished shoes. The front doors opened in the distance, and wind moved through the hall. A young parish clerk entered with a leather register wrapped in cloth. Water shone on his coat. He bowed awkwardly and placed the book before Judge Elwood. Pages turned. Everyone listened. There, between baptisms and burial entries, lay a private declaration recorded by Reverend Cole, Clara Evelyn, daughter of Evelyn Marsh and Thomas Whitmore, acknowledged under seal, with witnesses present. Judge Elwood read it twice. Then he looked at Clara, and his voice changed. Miss Whitmore. It was the first time an officer of the law had called her that. Clara closed her eyes for only a heartbeat. When she opened them, the room looked the same, yet nothing in it belonged to the lie as completely as before. Hartwell rose. This proves sentiment. Not title. Not legitimacy in the public sense. Not standing sufficient to challenge estate transfer. No one here has claimed the dukedom for her, Adrian said. We are claiming she was wrongfully deprived of legal protection, funds, identity, and liberty of movement. Hartwell smiled thinly. Liberty of movement? The girl was never restrained. Clara stood before she knew she would. The chair legs whispered against the floor. Her voice did not rise, but it traveled to every corner of the hall. When I asked to leave for Boston at 18, you told me I owed the estate for my upbringing. When I asked for wages, you said gratitude was payment enough. When I asked for my mother's portrait, you said servants do not inherit grief. When I signed household receipts, you removed my surname. When visitors came, you placed me beneath the portrait of my father and called resemblance imitation. No one moved. Even Hartwell seemed held still by the precision of what she remembered. Clara looked at Judge Elwood. Perhaps no door was locked every hour. But every road was made to end here. Martha's hand covered her mouth. Sheriff Carver lowered his eyes. Adrian looked at Clara as if each word had cut a chain he had not known he was standing beside. Judge Elwood folded the parish record closed. Mr. Hartwell, pending full review, your authority over any Whitmore documents, trust instruments, and estate accounts is suspended. Sheriff Carver, secure his cases. Hartwell's face hardened at last. You will regret treating a matter of lineage as theater. Judge Elwood's gaze sharpened. No, sir. I regret that it required theater to reveal a matter of law. Sheriff Carver stepped beside Hartwell, not roughly, not dramatically, simply with the calm inevitability of office. The sealed cases were taken. The ledgers were gathered. The room exhaled. Clara sat slowly, not because she was weak, but because justice, when it first arrives, can feel as overwhelming as grief. Adrian crossed to the west library doors visible beyond the hall and returned with the brass iris key. Before everyone, he placed it on the table in front of her. Until the court decides all else, he said, this key is yours. Clara looked at the key, then at him. There was no declaration of love in his face. No rescue demanding gratitude. Only a man acknowledging a boundary he should never have crossed. She lifted the key, and the metal caught the morning light. For years, Evershade Abbey had been a house where her name survived only in whispers. Now, in the great hall before law, servants, witnesses, and the sea beyond the windows, Clara Evelyn Whitmore was no longer a secret kept for other people's comfort. She was a fact. And facts, once spoken clearly, are very difficult to bury again. By late afternoon, the storm had moved east, leaving Evershade Abbey washed in a clear, cold light that made every window shine as if the house had opened its eyes after years of troubled sleep. The sea below the cliffs was still restless, but the sky above it had turned pale blue, and gulls circled over the black rocks where foam broke white against the shore. Clara Evelyn Whitmore stood in the West Library with the brass iris key in one hand and her father's sealed letter in the other. She had waited until the judge, the sheriff, and Hartwell had departed for Ravensport under formal review of the documents. She had waited until the servants stopped whispering in doorways and began moving through the abbey with a strange, cautious brightness. She had waited until she could breathe without feeling that every breath required permission. Now, at last, she broke the seal. The paper unfolded with a dry, delicate sound. Adrian Blackwood stood several feet away near the sea-facing windows, far enough to grant privacy, close enough that she was not alone. Clara read silently at first. Then the words blurred, and she began again aloud because some truths deserve witnesses. My dearest Clara, if this letter reaches your hands, then my silence has failed you less completely than I feared. I have been a coward in rooms where I should have been a father. I allowed society to make a secret of what should have been my pride. No title I held was ever as sacred as the name I gave you in my heart. My daughter. Her voice broke on the last two words, not loudly, not theatrically, only enough for the room to feel it. Adrian lowered his eyes. Outside, sunlight crossed the library floor and touched the small chair beside the desk where Clara had once sat as a child. She continued. The Whitmore Trust was created for those whom power forgets, widows, children, tenants, sailors' families, and you, my little Iris. If the law proves kinder than I was brave, use it not to build a throne of grievance, but a shelter no one can be sold out of again. Clara pressed the letter to her chest. For years she had wanted only proof that she belonged to the man whose portrait watched over the house. She had not expected an apology. She had not expected a charge. The door opened softly behind them, and Martha entered with a folded shawl over her arm, pretending she had come for practical reasons while her eyes shone with everything she would not say. The staff have gathered in the hall, Miss Whitmore, she said, careful with the name, reverent with it. They wish to know what you would like done. Clara looked around the library, at the shelves, the desk, the uncovered globes, the dust turning gold in the late light. What did one do when a prison became a home again? What did one command when freedom was still learning to stand? She folded the letter and placed it beside the diary. Open the house, she said quietly. The curtains first. Then the west rooms. And tomorrow, send word to the village school. The library will lend books again. Martha's face softened into a smile that carried 6 years of withheld hope. Yes, Miss Whitmore. When she left, Adrian remained by the window. He had removed his gloves, and in the unguarded light he looked less like the severe new duke who had entered in rain and more like a man standing at the edge of his own reckoning. Clara turned to him. What happens to the estate now? The transfer will be examined. The debts will be separated from Hartwell's alterations. The court may decide that I retained certain lands and rights, but the trust will be restored to you. Evershade itself may require negotiation. He paused. I will not contest what is yours. The answer was careful, honorable, and strangely painful. Clara had imagined justice as a door flung open. She had not considered the quiet rooms beyond it, where gratitude, grief, anger, and uncertainty would all be waiting with their hands folded. Yesterday, she said, you thought I was part of the inventory. Adrian accepted the words without defense. Yes. And today? He looked at the brass key in her hand, then at the letter on the desk, then finally at her. Today I think Evershade was never mine to awaken. It was waiting for you. Clara felt the sentence move through her more deeply than praise. He crossed the room and stopped before her, not too near. Then, with the solemnity of a man before an altar, he lowered himself to one knee. Not as a lover begging reward. Not as a duke performing drama. As a gentleman returning what should never have been taken. In his open palm lay the remaining keys of the abbey, the chapel, the greenhouse, the music room, the locked nursery, the old tenant office, the eastern gate. Miss Whitmore, he said, his voice low, I received these as master of this house. I return them as witness to its daughter. Clara stared at the keys until they blurred. No one had ever knelt to her innocence. No one had ever made respect visible. Slowly, she took them from his palm. Their fingers brushed only for a moment, brief and steady, and yet the whole room seemed to understand that something tender had begun where ownership ended. Downstairs, the first curtains were drawn open in the great hall. Light poured across the marble floor, over the inventory table, over the place where her name had once been written beneath silverware. Servants opened windows that had been sealed through 6 winters. The old mastiff barked once, startled by brightness. Somewhere in the chapel, Martha began to ring the bell by hand, not loudly at first, then stronger, until the sound traveled through stone, over the cliffs, and out toward Ravensport. Clara walked to the window beside Adrian. The village lay beyond the road, small and smoke-gray beneath the clearing sky. There were people there who had been denied coal, books, repairs, medicine, mercy, all while the trust meant for them was hidden behind elegant theft. Her father had failed in courage. Hartwell had failed in decency. Adrian, a stranger, had nearly failed through ignorance, and then chosen truth when truth became costly. Clara understood then that restoration was not the same as return. The past could not be made clean. Her mother would not hear her name spoken honorably in the hall. Her father would not stand beside her in daylight. The child she had been could not be given back the years spent lowering her eyes. But the woman she had become could open doors. She could sign her name. She could make the house shelter others instead of swallowing them. Adrian looked out at the sea. What will you do first? Clara closed her fingers around the keys. For the first time, the weight did not feel like a chain. It felt like purpose. I will remove my name from every ledger that calls me property, she said. Then I will write it where it belongs. A faint, almost sorrowful smile touched his face. And where is that? Clara looked back at Evershade Abbey, at the library awake with light, at the chapel bell trembling through the walls, at the servants standing taller in the hall below. On every door that opens for someone who has nowhere else to go. By sunset, the old house no longer looked like a mausoleum. Lamps glowed in the west wing. Smoke rose cleanly from the chimneys. The covered portraits were unveiled one by one, not to worship the past, but to stop fearing it. And in the library, beneath her father's letter, Clara wrote her full name in dark ink for the first time without hiding the page. Clara Evelyn Whitmore. Daughter of Evershade. Keeper of the trust. No longer inherited. No longer unnamed. Some hearts are not rescued by love alone. Some are restored by truth, by justice, and by the first person who sees them clearly enough to kneel before the name the world tried to erase.